Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. Today I'd like to continue discussing the book Lifespan by David Sinclair. And so this will be nice because we will get into some of the treatments or some of the things you can do in order to live longer in the next lesson. I will discuss them one by one actually in some nice detail so you guys can really have a good understanding. If you're reluctant to do something, I'll show you how important it is, and so that will be that. And so hopefully you enjoy this video. And so there was a Royal Society of 1660 based on new science, right? And this Royal Society actually had a 2-day meeting in 2010 where in that meeting they actually concluded that aging is not inevitable, but indeed it's a disease, while cancer, Alzheimer's, heart disease, like the top killers, are just old symptoms of old age. And David James actually wrote a report summarizing all about that meeting. And so in that meeting, there were people like Kenyon, who talked about the DAF16 gene that we mentioned that recycles NAD, Brian Kennedy, right, looking at conserved pathways, all of that stuff. They've looked at, there's people looking in like dwarf mice living twice longer due to fasting. Then there are also Maria Blaso talking about how old mammalian cells are more likely to lose their identity and become cancerous. And then they talked about preventative ways, and they concluded that aging is actually not inevitable, but indeed a disease. And so in 1825, Benjamin Gompetz actually talked about something called the law of human mortality. And he said that it's due to chance, which is the clock ticking randomly, as well as due to deterioration, where there is a high probability of disease over time. And so in yeast, this clock is due to the rRNA formation, and the other clock, the deterioration, is due to replication and expansion in these rRNA circles we discussed in the last video, which leads to SER2 gene, the SER2 gene actually moving away from the mating genes. And so just to give you an idea, reaching 80 is pretty much likely. Most people do that. Reaching 100, there's actually a 3 in 100 chance of that happening. Very unlikely. Of course, that will change in the future. Reaching 115 is 1 in 100 million, and reaching 130 is yet to be seen, is impossible. And so at the time of the 19th century, things like childbirth, accidents, infections, all these types of deaths were common and increasing. So these things increase deaths every 2 years, actually. Not anymore. Now, there's actually a 20-year increase in lifespan from 1960 and today. So people are living 20 years longer today than in the 1960s. Thank God, and that's due to elimination of childbirth, accidents, and infectious disease. In fact, the author's mom was a smoker and had a big lung tumor at the age of 50, where literally one lung was taken off from her. And she also had the SERPINAI deficiency. This is a special gene which caused white blood cells to attack her remaining lung, and that spread over 2 decades before she died in her 70s. At that time, she had enough time to literally visit 18 different countries and visit her grandchildren. So smoking, yeah, it affects you, can cause lung cancer, all that. In fact, it increases the chances of lung cancer by 5 times. And how does it do that? Well, it causes epigenetic changes, right, due to DNA damage. And so cells start to lose their identities faster and you get cancer. So now, of course, there's laws, programs not to smoke, health warning, tax incentives, all that to avoid this 5 times risk increase. But we tend to fight smoking and cancer, but not aging, which increases all of those risks. And being 50 increases the risk of cancer by 100 times relative to a 20-year-old. So relative to somebody in their 20s, being in the 50s increases it by 100 times. And then being in your 70s increases it by 1,000 times, again, relative to someone in their 20s. And so this is not only for cancer, same for heart disease and for diabetes and for most chronic diseases. So despite this, we don't do much about it. So in gerontology, we tend to treat one disease at a time, which only increases the risk for another disease. So yeah, you treat one, but you still get another. Eliminating all heart disease may give you 1.5 years of extra life, and cancer maybe 2.1. So in this increased risk by 1,000 between 20 and 70 is huge, right? And so we have reduced mortality more than morbidity, as Eileen Crimming said in 2015, right? And early mortality plays a role why there was an increase in 20-year 20 years increase in lifespan from 1960 to today. But of course, we still get sick. We still get different types of diseases as we get older, right? Due to that deterioration, due to that, due to the clock ticking, right, over time. And so, and also age of death is also affected by obesity, sedentary, people not moving, drug abuse or overdose, right? All that stuff as well, of course. And so actually the stats show that at 50, you may get some gray hair and more wrinkles. At 65, if no disease, you're fortunate, you're very lucky. At 80, you're guaranteed some ailment, so guaranteed something to happen to you when you're 80. And when you're 85, men have an average of 4 different diseases and women 5. But aging causes all of them, right? So it's essentially, why don't we treat them if aging causes all of them? If there's an 1,000-fold increase of disease from being of cancer, heart disease, or anything from being 70 to versus being in your 20s, and a person who's older, the risk of disease just increases so much more. And yet we treat one disease individually, which only increases the risk for another one. That's where gerontology is currently right now. And so, yeah, there's a lot of tests that you can test. David Sinclair talks about the sit test. So if you're young, you can easily get up with one move. If you're in your middle age, you need to push up with one hand. And if you're old, you literally need to get down on one knee to be able to stand up. And so, considering all this, we just accept death, even though it causes frailty and reduced resilience, and contributes to a huge risk for chronic disease like heart disease, cancer, diabetes, dementia, etc. And so most begin to experience aging actually long before the disease accumulation, even when they're still young. Even going through puberty earlier actually ages you faster. So our performance usually peaks in our 20s and 30s, right? And then we get weaker and weaker. In fact, the author's grandma Vera had she fell and she broke her femur, right, at the age of 88. And so typically there's if a person has like a hip fracture, half of those, if they're over 65, half of those die in 6 months. That's how crazy it is because of the infections and all that. So his grandmother at 88 broke her femur and never walked again, and died a few years later because of heart failure. So you can see, of course, over time, you start to increasing your risk largely. You can eat very healthy, you can do all those things, but still, eventually it will happen. And so, of course, the goal is to be able to prolong it as much as possible, and we'll talk about all of those things in upcoming videos. And so many other things happen as we age. Our wounds heal slower, and so that's very dangerous for people with diabetes because they have a 5-year mortality rate of over 50% if they get a foot ulcer, and then they may need an amputation, or right if the infection spreads, of course. And so aging clearly lowers quality of life, right? You can you can get very slow wound healing if you get an ulcer. You can literally die from a fracture, especially in the hip or in the femur. You can your risk for cancer just goes straight up. In fact, it plummets, right? The cells lose their identity, and it's just ridiculous the amount of things that can happen. And even though it decreases quality of life hugely, leading to pathology and all that, but it only impacts over half of the population, and we only look at things that are rare, that are less than 50%, because it happens to all of us aging, or like 90%, let's say even more, die from aging. it's normal. We don't do anything. It's inevitable. Therefore, we consider it inevitable and irreversible, even in the absence of injury, illness, environmental risk, poor lifestyle, even if we're eating healthy, are not exposed to secondhand smoke, or don't get injured, or ulcers at old age. Even if everything is fine, well, it's still inevitable. It's still gonna happen. And so we don't look at it. Having said it, we're very likely to actually be able to treat it in our lifetime. And in the upcoming lesson, I'll talk about exactly how we can tackle aging, or how we can essentially live a longer lifespan. So we'll talk about that first, and then also how we'll be able to tackle aging in the future. Now, is immortality possible? No, of course, but essentially we will be able to tackle aging. That's two different things. And so we'll talk about some of the treatments, or some of the things that are very natural that everybody can do from today, and they include things like fasting, intense exercise, etc. Okay, so yeah, let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next video. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so. I'm very appreciative. Thank you.